2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Joining us this morning, University of Newcastle Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes. Thank you for joining us again for our regular chat on all things political. I know there's a lot to speak about going on in the world of politics. Perhaps we'll have a look at the domestic front first this morning and then see how that impacts on the wider world and our place in it. We've got the Canning by-election coming along in Western Australia. Why is that so important for our political landscape at the moment, Jim?
Well, it's more important for the Abbott government to have a reasonable showing. Traditionally, by-elections are likely to be a negative for the an incumbent government. It's traditionally a time when voters sort of make their displeasure known.
Put out the protest votes.
Yes, because it doesn't really impact on the government's majority as such. In this particular case, it won't affect the government's overall majority in any way whatsoever, but it will affect the perception of the government. It will affect the way in which the government tries to position itself. So at the moment, Tony Abbott and his team are busily trying to make sure that the Canning by-election comes out as strongly in their favour as possible. The problem that they face is that there's been a redistribution of boundaries and that the electorate of Canning is not quite the same electorate that it was. It's still a Liberal seat, but it's not a strong... The margin in favour of the government now is reduced, and it's got to work a little bit harder. Hence, it's picked a candidate that it believes will appeal to the sort of demographic and the voters in Canning, and the Labor Party, of course, has been working very hard to try and counter that, to try and capitalise on the various levels of displeasure with the government, and in particular with the Prime Minister. So that's sort of the situation. If the government holds Canning, it probably means for Tony Abbott that his leadership is secure, and the pressure to reshuffle his ministry will probably be reduced. I don't think he will necessarily want to destabilise his own government as a result. But if the election goes against the government and they lose the seat of Canning, then there's likely to be all sorts of convulsions within, shall we say, behind closed doors. Whether Tony Abbott has the depth of numbers then to withstand that, I think that the sort of conventional wisdom is that if he loses Canning, he may well lose his hold on the leadership, because... His prime ministership, yes. Yeah.
And they've put an ex-military man forward as the candidate for the Liberal Party in Canning, haven't they?
Yes, and that's largely perhaps to appeal to the demographic of the electorate, the Western Australian, shall we say, perhaps more development-oriented, more mining-oriented, and less eastern seaboard oriented. So there's a sense of isolation in Western Australia, that the federal government doesn't really understand what goes on in WA, and is not funding Western Australia in the way that perhaps Western Australians might think they should be funded.
Now, how does all of this impact on the other big items that are going on in terms of politics nationally? Also in relation to things like Australia becoming involved in bombing raids in Syria?
Well, that's more tricky to sort of analyse, if you like, to sort of get a clear picture. The international level often is pursued by governments when they're trying to take some of the spotlight off their domestic politics, and ordinarily one would say yes,
it's a diversionary tactic.
It could be seen as a diversionary tactic, a way of refocusing people's attention. The problem that Tony Abbott faces here is there are sort of two of them. One is that while he can argue, and the government can argue, that the decision to support or to assist the US in increased airstrikes and use Australian fighter pilots to be part of that, while he can argue that that's an extension of the existing mission in Iraq, it's possibly a big stretch in terms of the logic involved. And the risk element, I think, is one that increases quite dramatically, because while the Australian fighter pilots who are based in the Middle East. I think they're based in the United Arab Emirates.
They are, yeah.
To get to Syria, they've got to fly pretty well the length of Iraq. They've got to be in the air a long time, and they've only got a short window while they're in Syria, if you like. So they're in the air longer. There's higher risk that they might be shot down, and if one plane gets shot down, then Tony Abbott's strategy, if you like, of taking the pressure off the domestic politics and putting the focus internationally will come back to haunt him in a really big way.
Can I ask the question, Jim? On one hand, we're talking about increased bombing raids on Syria. The other thing that's, across our minds and thoughts and hearts at the moment is this sea of humanity that is trying desperately to get out of that part of the world. I think most Australians would agree that they're innocent. They seem like innocent people who just want to have a normal life, and we're seeing places like Germany, Hungary, Austria, Italy, Greece being completely bombarded with thousands upon thousands. I think in one day alone, Germany had 15,000 people come across the border. So how does that balance up with increased airstrikes?
Well, it doesn't really. It's the two don't sit neatly together in a supportive way. In fact, one might argue that one exacerbates the other. That's to say that increased bombing raids is likely to increase the flow of refugees. One of the big factors that has been reported as to why people are leaving Syria in droves is because of the bombings. Yes, none of them want to stay around to be taken over by Daesh or IS or any of the other militant groups, and trying to survive in that sort of environment is very, very, very bad. However, the dominant story coming out from the refugees as they get into Europe is largely that they're leaving the country because of the fear of the bombing. Now, increasing bombing raids doesn't seem to square with trying to stem the flow of refugees or to encourage them to stay back in Syria. That's sort of one dynamic which the government is buying into, and it's has to try and then square that sort of activity, the logic of it, with the fact that it's also taking a, shall we say, a rather semantic option on increasing the intake of refugees or increasing the Syrian refugees, shall we say. The issue here is that they're not increasing the total number of refugees. The intake's going to remain the same, but they are contemplating offering more places to the Syrian refugees at the same time as they're contemplating perhaps contributing to the flow of refugees. So it's a bit of a mess, and I'm not sure the government is really thinking its way through this in as clear a way as possible. But at present, its domestic issues are sort of looming large, and being seen to be part of an international effort also plays out well in terms of local politics. So I think it's a gamble across the board now for Tony Abbott. In 2 weeks' time, if Canning falls, then he's likely to fall, regardless of anything else.
Very interesting times we are living in. Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes, thank you so much, and we'll catch up with you next Tuesday.
My pleasure, Meryl.